Okay, so we're just about coming up to the top of the hour, so I'll get started. Lovely to have so many of you here today. My name's Christina Silver. I work at the University of Surrey in Guildford in the UK in the Sociology department, where I manage a project called the MAXDAYS Networking Project, which is all about raising awareness and building capacity in the use of digital tools for qualitative data analysis, computer-assisted qualitative data analysis. I've been working there for a long time and using MAXQDA for a long time as well, more than 20 years I think now. So hopefully I can share some tips and tricks with you along the way today, and hopefully that's useful to you. As I've said already, do please connect. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions after the session. Okay, so I'm going to get started. And I want to talk about literature reviewing today and start to open up our minds a little bit about how powerful MAXQDA is. And I'm going to start off just by focusing or grounding our thinking in methodologies. So just like there are many different approaches to analysing qualitative data, there are many different literature review methodologies. So I guess the first really important thing to say is that how you use MAXQDA tools for literature reviewing will depend to a large degree on what your literature review methodology is. Okay, and here is just a screenshot of a very well-known, I think, article about different types of reviews, which they've organised, Grant and Booth, into a typology of different review types. And here you can see the names of those review types that they discuss. Okay, so there's lots of different literature review methodologies, and there are lots of different tools available in MAXQDA that can help depending on which methodology you're using. But what I want to say about these broadly is that whatever sort of type of methodology we have, it's possible to really at a high level think about some common processes. So I would argue that regardless of which literature review methodology you're undertaking, you need to engage in these 6 high-level things, which are often thought of as happening kind of in a process, which is illustrated by the arrows on this diagram. So we all need to specify the objectives of our review and define research questions around that. We need to identify the relevant materials, the literature or the evidence or other forms of materials to answer those objectives, those questions. We need to capture the evidence in some way within those. We need to appraise it. We need to synthesize it, bring it together, and then we need to communicate our findings. How we actually go about doing that, the strategies, the plans that we develop will be affected by those methodologies. But on some level, we are all involved in those 6 high-level activities. You can see in the middle of my diagram, however, this kind of very common thing that we think about for any approach to analysing any form of qualitative material is that we need to plan what we're doing, really, really important, and iteration. We continually flick backwards and forwards, revisit our materials from different perspectives at different stages. And what I'm sure many of you are already aware, those of you who've been using MAXQDA for a while, but also those of you who are new to it, is that MAXQDA is very much designed to facilitate and encourage and help you manage that iterative process. Okay, so that's a little bit of a high level thinking first of all. What I also like to think about is that there is a kind of spectrum of review types. So within those review types I had on screen earlier, the kind of more systematic approaches, so systematic literature review, rapid evidence reviews, things like that, they tend to be more strict in terms of the criteria of how you go about doing the review, and they may be more quantitative in the kinds of outputs that you want to generate. Whereas if you're doing a more in-depth literature review, so classic example might be if I was doing a PhD project or a dissertation for some study, then I may be doing a literature review as part of a larger study. And then I've got more flexibility about how I go about that literature review, maybe in terms of the materials I gather and all of those other stages that I mentioned. And it may be that that's a more incremental, flexible, more qualitative approach. I may be using my interpretive skills slightly differently from when I'm working in a more systematic approach. That's not to say that in-depth literature reviews are not systematic. It's just that certain types of literature review methodology are named as systematic in some way. What I really want to emphasize, though, is that MAXQDA, the tools that we have at our disposal in MAXQDA allow us to move along this spectrum at various different of those stages that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so I wouldn't say that MAXQDA is better for certain types of literature review. I think it has tools that can be really powerful, whatever your literature review methodology is. And we, as researchers, are the architects of how we harness those tools for our methodologies. And we can oscillate, move along backwards and forwards that spectrum at different stages. But I do think that it's quite useful to have in mind that idea of the kind of more strict, more quantitative, as opposed to the more flexible, more qualitative way that we might want to work with our literature. Okay, one more kind of high level slide, just because I get asked often, if I'm doing a project that involves a literature review and also a data analysis later on, should I be working with two MAXQDA projects? Should I have one MAXQDA project for my literature review and then create a second one when I'm at the stage when I want to analyze my qualitative materials that I've developed, generated empirically maybe? Generally speaking, my answer would probably be no, right? Normally I would say, okay, one research project, one MAXQDA project. So in that kind of in-depth literature review example, let me just show you what I mean by that. If I've got a code, okay, a concept, a theme, a category, if I was working with literature initially, then I can bring full text literature files in. I'm going to show you some of that later. And I can code directly onto those full text articles where I see that concept appearing in the literature. And whilst I'm doing that, I can be writing my appraisals. Okay, so I can write one appraisal, maybe in a memo or a document, for each piece of literature, each piece of evidence that I'm reviewing. And those appraisals can be linked directly to those literature files that I'm working with. But those appraisals in MAXQDA, if I work with them as documents, can also be coded. So I can gather at a code in the software what the literature is saying about something that I'm interested in, but also I can code what I thought about that literature when I read it, about that same concept. And when I open up that code, I can see both of those pieces of evidence together in one place. Let's imagine that I've been through my literature review and I go and gather some data in some way. Maybe I'm interviewing people or working with secondary materials. Either way, I can bring my data files into MAXQDA, and you will have seen examples of that in other sessions today already, I'm sure. And those data will be speaking to some of the same concepts, and they can also be coded to the same code. Okay, and as I'm doing that, I can also start to write my interpretations in relation to my research objectives. And they, again, in the same way that appraisals can be linked to literature, my interpretations can also be linked to the data, and they can potentially also be coded. Okay, so what I'm trying to illustrate with this slide is the idea that a code allows me to gather the evidence about a concept, a theme, a category, whatever the code is representing in your project, and pull together the evidence from these four different places in your process, if you like. So what that really means is that later on, when I retrieve those coded segments, I can see what the literature has said about this concept, what I thought about it when I read it, what my data is now saying about it, and what I'm now thinking in terms of my interpretation. And tracing through those different stages, I think, is a really powerful way of thinking about using the software. So I just wanted to kind of make that point, because I get asked very frequently about, you know, should the data analysis be separate from the literature review? And in my mind, if one follows from the other, as is often the case, having it all together in one place can be really, really useful. Okay, so having kind of set the stage a little bit, as it were, with those initial slides, let's turn our attention to the software and be a little bit more concrete. So this is my list of some, I don't think this is exhaustive, but some of the features that MAXQDA provides us that we can use for literature reviews. There are many, many, many. Why are there so many? Because literature reviewing is a form of qualitative data analysis. So you can argue that most of the features that MAXQDA provides to us can be used for literature reviewing. But there are, of course, some which are specifically designed for working with literature. The two points on my bullet point list here in green are topics that I demonstrated and spoke specifically about in my Spotlight on Literature Reviewing last year, which is available on my YouTube channel. So I'm not going to repeat that. You can go and have a look at that later. I haven't got time in this Spotlight to talk about all of these different things. So what I've done is I've chosen a couple of kind of what I think are really useful analytic strategies when I'm working with the literature review that I want to focus on today. Okay, and they are going to be narrowing the pool. So I'm going to think a little bit about having gathered lots of pieces of literature and then having to think about, okay, which ones am I going to take forward and look at in more detail? And that's a process that's often called screening in a literature review method. So I'm going to show you one way of going about doing that using MAXQDA. And then I'm also going to talk about how we can use some of MAXQDA's tools to assess the quality of the literature that we're working with. And I will make some comments about the difference between the quantification of quality and the kind of interpretive assessment of quality by capturing and appraising materials. So those are the two things I'm going to focus on in this particular spotlight. Okay, I'm using a real example for this, which is drawn from a PhD student working at the University of Warsaw, who I coached through her early stages of using MAXQDA for a systematic literature review. And she was looking at how research into green behaviours in workplace settings had developed over the past decade. That's the research question that I'm thinking about for my example here. Just to give you a little bit of background context, she identified 1,600 articles using Zotero. And initially she imported using an RIS import, and that process is in that video I mentioned earlier, into MAXQDA. I've got a much reduced sample of those 1,600 to show you today, but she's interested in the substantive topics of green behaviours, workplace settings, and also interested, what I want to talk about today is doing a little bit of a literature review, looking at the way that these topics have been researched in the past. So that's just to give you a little bit of context. Okay, so this first task of narrowing the pool, so screening for inclusion and exclusion. So when you've got a large amount of files, you're not necessarily, depending on your methodology, going to want to look at them all in the same amount of detail. You need to make some decisions about which ones you're going to take forward for more in-depth analysis, maybe. Okay, so I'm going to show you the process of screening abstracts. So we're working with the abstracts based on some predetermined criteria, and how we can use coding in order to do that process and then remove the rejected articles afterwards. So that's what I'm going to initially show you as I now flick into my MAXQDA project to show you that process. So what I've got on screen here is this small sample of the materials. And if I just activate this group, you'll see that I've got 80. Can you see there's 80 down at the bottom here? There are 80 documents in here, not 1600, just to make it a bit more easy to work with in a demonstration setting. What we've got here on the document is the information that's imported from the RIS, so not working with the full text articles at this stage. Okay, so what I want to do is to go through and make a decision about which ones, based on the abstracts, to take forward. The first stage of that, I think, is to come up with the criteria for that screening process, and I've got those captured in memos. So I'm just going to go to all my memos, and you'll see here that I have got a memo where I've just listed out what the screening criteria are. So just because you can't read this all and think about it quickly, one of the things was that they've all got to have a workplace setting, so not interested in green behaviours outside of workplace settings, but can be focused on particular different attitudes or behaviours. So the first stage is to make the decisions about how you're going to make the choice about what stays in and what stays out. Okay, so I've got that in a memo so that I can refer back to it and remind myself at any stage. And what I said to you is I was going to use coding as that process. So here you can see I've got a group of codes called screening, and I've got one code which I've labelled in red, which is rejected. And that's going to be where I'm saying, okay, this abstract doesn't meet the criteria, so I'm going to reject it. And then I've got 3 green codes, which actually have subcodes underneath, which are capturing the information within the abstract where I'm making the decision that I'm going to keep it. Okay, so let me just show you that process. I've got a few that I've done already here. So I'll go to this first one here. This is an article by Anderson. And you can see here that this abstract has got 2 green codes applied to it. So in this example, we needed to have a workplace focus. So I've got a code called technology workplace, which is this one here, where I'm saying, okay, this one goes in because it's got a focus on a workplace, and I'm coding what that workplace context is, technology in this example, and it's got either a green attitude or a green behavior. In this example, it was becoming green. So I'm using coding for the whole abstract to say this is the reasons why this one that I take this one forward. Okay, here you can see that I've also made that document itself, given it a green color so that I can see in my list which ones I'm taking forward and which ones I'm not. Here's another one that I've also taken forward. This one's got a hotels focus and it's an implementation practices. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm reading this and making a decision and coding in the green color for the reasons why I'm keeping it. What I'm doing with the ones that I'm rejecting is they obviously don't get coded to the green ones because they're not meeting the criteria, so I'm rejecting it. But I'm not just rejecting it and then not saying why. What I'm doing is I'm using the comments. Can you see? I don't know if you're aware of comments, but comments are little notes, a bit like comments in a Microsoft Word file. And I know that this one, this code application for rejected has been commented on because the circle is filled in. When I hover my cursor over there, you should be able to see that I've indicated in the comment why I'm rejecting it. It's got no workplace focus. This is just a general consumer focus, therefore it doesn't meet my criteria. So I'm coding it. I'm also justifying the rejection in the comment, and I'm also adding that red indication in the document as well. And the process would be to go through, and you can see I've done quite a few of these here. Okay, so I'm doing that by coding. Okay, what do I do next? Well, there's various things that I can do here. Let me just take the activation off. So let's imagine I've been through and I've decided that I want to get rid of them. I will always check before I actually remove them from my MAXQDA project. And the fact that I've coded them here makes that possible. So if I double click on my rejected code, here are coded in the coded segments overview window, all of the abstracts that I have rejected through that coding process, plus all of the justification for the rejection in the comments. So I can go through and double check it before I actually remove them. Always a good idea to go back and make sure that the way I was thinking about these initially is the way I want to carry on thinking about them. But let's imagine that I'm happy with that. What I can now do is something which is really very helpful, is I can right click on that rejected code and I can activate the documents containing this code. Okay, at the moment I've got no documents activated. Activation, if you're new to MAXQDA, is basically you're basically, it's like a filter. You're basically saying these are the ones I want to focus on right now. So if I activate all of the documents that have got that code, that's going to be 6, right? Because I've got 6 whole abstracts and I'm coding the whole abstracts here. The reason I do that, once I've activated them, I've now got 6 activated here. When I scroll right down at the bottom, I can now, out of those activated codes, I can create a new set. So I've activated, sorry, not the activated codes, the activated documents. I've activated the documents that have got the rejected abstracts in them. And then I create a new set and I can say here, rejected. Okay. Then what I could also do is I could take that activation off and I could also do the opposite. So I could activate all of the ones which I've decided to keep, and then I've got one set of rejected documents and one set of documents which are not rejected. And I can either keep them in here if I don't want to get rid of them completely, or I can then, once I've created the set, I can then go through and remove them from my MAXQDA project so that I'm narrowing my focus down. And what I would then do would be to bring in the full text articles for the ones that I haven't rejected, in order I can then do my next stage of analysis on the full text articles. So hopefully that makes sense as a process, and that's something that I find particularly useful when I've identified a really large number of articles from the titles or however that process has happened initially. So that's the idea of narrowing the pool. And on the slide that you've got in your handout, you've got a reminder here of that process. Okay, so the second thing that I wanted to talk about today is thinking about assessing the quality. Okay, and that for me speaks to 2 of those high level activities that I mentioned in my kind of flow diagram at the beginning, which are to do with capturing the evidence and appraising the evidence. Okay, now what I'm talking about here is to do with making some decisions about the quality of the research that has been done around this topic previously. Okay, remember that in my starting point, or kind of research questions objectives for this piece of work, was to understand how this topic had been researched over time, and part of that is substantive, of course, what are the things that have been researched, but the other part of that is how they've been researched, and making some judgment as a scholar about the quality of the research that has happened. And that's something that is relevant across that spectrum of literature review methodologies, in my opinion. However, as you can see at the top of my slide here, what those quality criteria are definitely going to differ according to the literature review methodology. Okay, so if you're judging a qualitative study into this topic of green behaviours, then the criteria for what constitutes a good qualitative piece of research is very different from the criteria for what constitutes a good quantitative study or a mixed method study. So you would have to come up with different criteria for making the judgment according to the nature of the research that had been done. Okay, and also that may differ in relation to the focus of the review. So coming up with those criteria for what constitutes a good or not piece of research is determined both by the study type and what it is that you're focusing on in your review. But what I'm going to do today is talk about 3 different levels at which this kind of assessing of quality can happen. The article level, okay, the segment level, and what I call the interpretive level. Okay, and I'm going to show you one example of each of these. Okay, these are not necessarily the only ways that you could make these assessments of quality at each of these levels, but because of time today, I'm focusing on one for each. So let me bring up MAXQDA again. I seem to have lost my mouse, which is slightly annoying. So I'm going to open up a different. Ooh, what's going on? I'm going to open up a different version of the project, which has got some full text articles in it. So this is the same project, but as well as the references, which we were looking at before, I've also got some full texts for some of the articles as an example. Okay, and what I'm going to do first of all is talk about making this judgment on the level of the documents. Okay, now you may be aware, so now I'm working with the full text. I've moved my attention from the abstracts to the full texts. Okay, and you may be aware that you can apply variables to documents. Variables are like factual characteristics about the whole document. So what I'll do, the documents, let me open up a full text so you can see. Here's the full text of that Anderson one that I was looking at previously in the abstracts. But if I go to the variables main menu in my MAXQDA and I bring up a list of the document variables, there are lots of variables here. The red ones, by the way, if you don't already know, they are system variables. Those are ones that MAXQDA generates for you. Okay, the blue ones here are ones that I've generated myself. Okay, and I'm going to create another one now just to show you the process. So I'm going to call one, I'm going to call it quality. Now I can decide whether I want the values to be textual. If I left it on text, then the values would be high quality, medium quality, low quality, or something like that based on my criteria. Or I could use an integer, so I could use numbers. I could say, okay, number 1 means it's really excellent. Number 2 means it's kind of okay. Number 3 means it's not so good, however I want to do that. Or I can use Boolean, yes, no's. I'll do that one for now, just to show you that process. Click OK, and I've got a new variable here. And then I'm just going to flick using this little icon here, which is the same as this one here, just a quicker way of doing it from the floating window. That will change me my view here to the document, the data editor for all variables, just to make things a little bit easier to see. I'm just going to activate my full text and then click on this icon to filter this table. So I'm just looking at the full texts, just so that is a bit easier to see in this quick demonstration. So I've got one row for each document. If I move along here, then you can see all of the variables. So these other ones are ones I've already filled out. And here's my quality one. Okay, so what the process would be, as I'm reading through the article, I could make a decision that this one is of good quality, whereas the next two aren't. This one is, maybe this one is. Today I'm making it up, of course. In a real situation, I would be doing this as I was reading each article, and I would have my criteria. Again, I'd have a memo where I've written out what the criteria are for making this quality judgment. But the process of indicating what is good quality or not on the document level, this is one way of doing that. Okay, why is this useful? It's useful because later on I can create a subset. Remember, I showed you sets a moment ago. I can create a subset based on that quality criteria. So having applied that document variable, the values of that quality variable, I can then later on activate based on variables. So let me just get rid of that one, that's from earlier. I can go down here and I can say, okay, I want to find all of the articles that I said were of good quality. That's what the number 1 means, the value. You can see here it's found 6. And then I can create a new set, and it's automatically created a new set here called quality equals 1. These are all the ones I decided are of good quality. I would probably rename this and say something so that I remember what number 1 means. And then I can also then say, okay, I want to create the converse. So I would then also create the ones which didn't have the number 1 in. So the ones which were empty, and there are lots of them there. And I would then create another set for those ones. And then I'm making a decision. These are the good ones. These are the not so good ones. So that's one way that I can do it on the level of the document. I'm aware that I'm running out of time. So I'm just going to flick quickly and talk about a couple of the other ones. I want to talk about evaluative codes. The problem with what I've just shown you is all I'm doing by applying that document variable is I'm basically saying this is good and this is not good. So it's like I'm piling them up if I had paper, but I'm not capturing the evidence for why I thought it was good by doing that. I'm just capturing that it's good. Okay, and coding obviously allows us to mark in the actual article where we are seeing evidence for something being of a high quality. So that can be done through coding. So here I've got 3 codes: high quality, medium quality, low quality. Okay, and what I've done is I have applied that code. Let me just show you one instance here. To the evidence where I see it, but I haven't just said high quality, low quality. I've also coded for what it is that is high quality. Okay, so in relation to what I was talking about before, this is the idea about this was about judging the quality of the research that has been done. So I would first of all come up with key things I want to capture. So the data sources, the population under study, the analytic methods. It's all something I'm always very interested in. Often articles are not talking very much in depth about how they've done the analysis, and I want to capture that. So every time that I'm coding to one of these methods codes, I'm also coding to the evaluative codes. Why? The reason why is so that I can do a comparison later in one of the very powerful visual tools that we have in MAXQDA. Is I can say, okay, I want to do a code relation browser of the activated code. So that's these methods codes by the evaluative code. So I'm just quickly choosing the evaluative codes. If you don't know how to do this, you can watch the video back afterwards and go a bit more slowly to watch how I actually did it. But now what I've got here is a code relation browser of my 3 quality codes by the data sources. Okay, and not only can I quantify, okay, this is showing me the number of instances. I can also change that to the number of articles by clicking on this icon here. Counts the hits once only. So this is the number of articles that I said are high, medium, or low quality in relation to these aspects. And I can also change that to the number of coded segments at each intersection. And I can also, which I think is really, really important for communicating all of this, is that I can bring up the interactive quote matrix, and then I can see in here the actual evidence. So these are the coded segments for high quality analytic methods, medium quality, low quality, etc. So can you see how this is doing something slightly different in that I'm capturing the evidence for the quality, which is different from just piling up the articles. And actually I might do both. Okay, I am running out of time. In fact, I have already run out of time. So I might just stop there and see how many questions there are. And then I can always talk about my other third thing if I've got time after